I've never said that we're not going to prosecute. It is not that I've said that I can do nothing. What I have said, and I've been precise with my wording on purpose, is that we don't have statutes in this state that directly address the issue. I want to be very clear about this. I don't make prosecutorial decisions based on partisan or political preferences. Never have.
Hi again, everyone. It is 5 o'clock in New York. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. That man you just heard was Nevada's Attorney General, Aaron Ford, who so far has remained tight-lipped about whether he would prosecute those who served as fake electors in his state in the 2020 presidential election. Well, new reporting from Politico reveals that now Attorney General Ford is investigating those individuals. From their findings, quote, in recent weeks, investigators have questioned witnesses about the attempts of these so-called alternate electors to present themselves as viable representatives of the state's voters. That's according to 3 people familiar with the probe. Investigators have also asked about documents those people prepared as part of the effort. The probe, which until now has not been publicly reported, is the latest sign of potential legal jeopardy for Republicans who, amid Trump's bid to cling to power, posed as electors in states that Biden won. In the last presidential election, Nevada and its 6 electoral votes went for now President Joe Biden. He won the state by 33,000 votes. But 6 Republicans, including Nevada Republican Party Chair Michael McDonald, signed a fake electoral certificate on December 14, 2020, which they then sent to Washington, D.C., falsely declaring Trump as the winner of Nevada. We know that 2 of those under the Nevada AG's investigation, McDonald and Nevada GOP Vice Chair Jim DeGraffenreid, appeared before the D.C. grand jury investigating January 6 this summer. And McDonald was also questioned by the 1-6 Select Committee last year, where he invoked the Fifth Amendment over 200 times. As Politico notes, the status of Ford's probe, including whether he will seek indictments, is unclear. It's also not clear whether Ford is investigating anyone outside of Nevada. Nevada was just one of 7 states where fake electors submitted a false slate of electoral college votes. In Michigan, Attorney General Dana Nessel has since charged 16 fake electors with 8 felonies each for their role in that scheme. Bonnie Willis in Fulton County, Georgia, charged 3 fake electors in her racketeering case. And the Attorney General of Arizona has signaled she, too, is looking into the fake electors from her state. And that is where we start this hour with the reporter whose byline is on that reporting, Politico national correspondent Betsy Woodruff Swan. Also with us, voting rights attorney and founder of the site Democracy Docket, Mark Elias, and former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, now an MSNBC legal analyst, Andrew Weissman is back. Betsy, let's start with you. Tell us more about what you uncovered in your reporting.
What we now know is that the Nevada Attorney General is actively looking at this issue, despite the fact that earlier this year he signaled it was not an issue that he believed warranted a criminal investigation. Now, there are usually 2 reasons that criminal investigators can change their views in situations like this. One might be that their analysis of the law changes. Another might be that their understanding of the facts as to what happened changed. We have no reason to believe it's the former in the case of Nevada's Attorney General, but there are, of course, large outstanding questions about what facts his office has gathered as they've been casting a wide net to interview people who were close to the mechanisms and the inner workings of Nevada's presidential election in 2020. One person who I spoke with on the record, who spoke to me on the record for this story, was the registrar of Clark County. That's the largest county in Nevada. This was the person who was supervising so much of the way that Nevada's election worked in his county in 2020. And he told me he had been in contact with a state investigator who was seeking information about those alternate electors. We know that these investigators are asking about the meeting that the alternate electors had, or fake electors, I should say, on December 14th, where they put forward their claim that they were the real true electors. And they're also, of course, asking about the documents in question that the fake electors actually prepared in order to try to present themselves as viable representatives of the Nevada vote.
Andrew Weissman, what does that all indicate to you?
A serious question that I have for Betsy, which is where in God's green earth has this Attorney General been? I mean, this is something that I'm not saying that you're at the point where you should bring the criminal case, but my word, that we're seeing an investigation now. I mean, did you not listen to the January 6th committee hearings? You should have been ahead of that, but even if you weren't ahead of it, where have you been? I can understand in Pennsylvania why the facts are a little different there, because the electors there insisted that they wanted specific language that said they're contingent electors, so that anyone looking at their certificates would see they're only there if a court determined that they were actually the real electors. That's a very different thing than posing as the real electors and having the piece of paper say we're the real electors, because the whole point of it was then to give it to Congress so it could be a reason to overturn the will of the people. I don't understand why this has taken this long.
I'm going to put a pin in your question to Betsy, because I feel like you're now acting as her editor and you've given her an assignment. I want to go a closer look at one of the Nevada fake electors, and that's the state GOP chair, Michael McDonald. According to NBC, has a close personal friendship with Trump. And in recent months, he had visited Mar-a-Lago as part of a Nevada delegation Trump was courting for endorsements. And as we mentioned before, McDonald testified before the January 6th Select Committee, where he invoked his Fifth Amendment right more than 200 times. What type of information do you think that they will be seeking from him? What is he then able to offer?
Well, the fact that he's a close personal friend obviously would give him a motive to be posing as a fake elector. You obviously want to know his intent when he participated in the scheme. Was he told, for instance, by a lawyer that it was legit? It's hard for me to see the advice of counsel defense that's been sort of floated at various times, because the theory here is that you are posing as a fake elector. You're not here as a contingent one waiting for the court to say you're real. You're posing as the real elector, but you know you haven't complied with all of the legal rules to be an elector. So you definitely want to get those pieces, but you'd also want to know from him what conversations he had with, for instance, the former president. The one final piece, just because I'm a lawyer, which is taking the Fifth Amendment, there's nothing wrong with that. So, yes, we can talk about it, but, you know, it's his right to take the Fifth Amendment and for the government to have to prove its case without that testimony.
I appreciate that asterisk from you. Mark, each state is different in terms of its statutes, which is what the Nevada AG was referencing in that opening sound, but I'm not sure if you heard it. But from your view, what do you think the likelihood is these fake electors being charged in Nevada?
Look, I think there are some real aggravating factors in Nevada that haven't been discussed yet. The first is I was the lawyer for President Biden and the DNC in an election contest brought by Donald Trump to try to, through the courts, overturn the outcome of that election. That election contest was resolved by the state Supreme Court prior to this fake elector scheme. So by the point that the fake electors here were signing this document, to Andrew's point, there was no contingency left. The state Supreme Court had ruled on a final case that Joe Biden had won the election. It's also worth noting that Biden had won the election by 2.5%. So it wasn't a particularly close election. And then the final thing I would say is that Nevada, unlike almost any other state that I'm familiar with, their elections are certified in the first instance by their state Supreme Court, not just by their Secretary of State. And so there may be some angle here that involves that process, because before the governor signs a certificate of ascertainment that goes to the National Archives, the state Supreme Court puts its seal and its imprimatur on the final election results. So that's Nevada. In terms of how this fits into a national picture, you know, it is important that the rule of law be upheld and that all of the people who participated in this scheme be prosecuted under whatever statutes are available. I have a lot of confidence in Attorney General Ford. He's a very good Attorney General, and hopefully that's what will happen in Nevada.
Betsy, you write about a tie between the Nevada fake electors and someone who's recently pleaded guilty in the Georgia racketeering probe, Kenneth Chesebro. Can you talk more about that connection?
Yeah, that's right. One of these fake electors, according to the January 6th Select Committee's report, was in touch with Kenneth Chesebro when he was working with the Trump campaign on their nationwide effort to reverse the election outcome. And there was an email exchange, at the bare minimum, one email cited in the January 6th committee showing that there certainly appeared to be coordination between Trump's lawyers and the people on the ground in Nevada. One of the biggest outstanding questions about Ford's investigation is whether he's looking at the Trump campaign operatives and allies who played an instrumental and essential role in organizing this alternate elector scheme, this fake elector scheme that we saw play out. Many people view the fake electors as essentially tools, people who have of course, knowingly and deliberately participated, but very much at the direction of Trump, of Trump's lawyers, and of Trump's allies. One of the biggest questions related to the Nevada probe is Aaron Ford going to follow the strategy that Michigan's attorney general has taken and just go after the alternate electors themselves? Or will the shape of his investigation look more like Fulton County DA Fani Willis's, looking not just at these fake electors, but also at people from out of state, people close to Trump's orbit who played an essential and necessary and pivotal role in the activity that these electors participated in, which, of course, has now gotten them scrutiny from law enforcement.
What do you think about that question of scope?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because when you look at the Jack Smith indictment, it is talking about a top-down scheme, that this is orchestrated according to his charges from the Trump campaign to the field. This wasn't some grassroots project that a particular state said, oh, there's an issue here. Everyone always talks about Hawaii in 1960. That's not what you're seeing from either Jack Smith or Fani Willis. And so I think that connectivity that Betsy's talking about to the Trump campaign, I think is sort of essential, certainly if you're Jack Smith or Fani Willis, but I would think that if you're an attorney general, you would want to know that piece as well. And if you can, if the facts bear it out, to bring all of those people to justice.
Mark Elias.